Richard Caldwell had always been a man who commanded attention. At 34, his towering frame, confident stride, and sharp jawline made him a magnetic presence at Oakwood Academy, a prestigious institution nestled in the heart of Seattle. His colleagues envied his rapport with students, while the students themselves idolized him. Richard had a knack for blending professionalism with a personal touch, making everyone feel seen, valued, and understood. Yet beneath this polished exterior lurked a darkness that only Richard himself knew existed. He had built his life carefully, crafting a perfect image that left no room for suspicion. By day, he was a brilliant teacher and the celebrated coach of the girls' basketball team. By night, he indulged in fantasies of control and manipulation. And now, at Oakwood, he found the perfect setting to act on his desires. Two students in particular had caught his eye, Laura Bennett and Madison Collins. Laura was the quiet one, her unassuming demeanor rendering her almost invisible in the bustling halls of Oakwood. At 16, she was soft-spoken with her nose often buried in books. Her only solace was the basketball team, where she could express herself without words. Laura wasn't used to attention, least of all from someone like Mr. Caldwell. Madison, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight. At 18, she was everything Laura wasn't: confident, beautiful, and assertive. As the team captain, she was used to being the center of attention, basking in the admiration of peers and coaches alike. Madison had a magnetic charm that few could resist, and she knew it. Richard saw potential in both girls. To Laura, he offered encouragement and support, slowly building her trust through compliments and one-on-one sessions. For Madison, he fed her ego, making her feel unique and irreplaceable. He told each girl what they wanted to hear, weaving a web of lies that bound them both. What neither girl knew was that Richard's intentions were far from pure. Laura Bennett couldn't believe how her life had changed in just a few short months. For the first time, someone was paying attention to her. Not just anyone, but Mr. Caldwell, her basketball coach and history teacher. He had an air of confidence that made her feel safe, seen, and, most of all, important. Initially, his gestures seemed innocent, a thumbs up and a graduating class when she made a good play. But those moments soon turned into something more personal. "You're really improving, Laura," he said one afternoon after practice, his voice warm and genuine. "You've got potential. Keep it up." Those words stayed with her long after she left the gym, echoing in her mind as she studied, as she lay in bed at night. He made her feel special, like she mattered in a way no one else had before. Then came the texts. At first, they were strictly professional. Tips for improving her jump shot, reminders about upcoming games. But they quickly grew more personal. He asked about her classes, her family, her dreams for the future. He seemed to care in a way no one else did. "It's tough being the quiet one, isn't it?" he wrote one evening. "But trust me, Laura, you've got so much more going for you than you realize." Laura's heart raced as she read his messages, her cheeks flushing with warmth. She didn't see the danger in his words, only the comfort they brought. Madison Collins was no stranger to attention, but Mr. Caldwell's was different. She had always been the star, the top scorer on the basketball team, the girl everyone wanted to befriend. But with Mr. Caldwell, she felt a connection that went beyond admiration. "You're a natural leader, Madison," he told her after practice one evening. "The team looks up to you." "I do, too." She'd smiled at him, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she responded, "Well, I learned from the best." Their banter grew more playful over time. Text about game strategies turned into late-night exchanges filled with inside jokes and teasing remarks. Madison thrived on the attention, convinced she had something with Mr. Caldwell that no one else could understand. He had a way of making her feel irreplaceable, like she was the only one who truly mattered. Richard Caldwell played his roles with precision. With Laura, he was the kind and supportive mentor, always there to guide her through her insecurities. With Madison, he was the charming confidant, feeding her confidence and stroking her ego. What neither of them knew was that they were pieces in a game Richard controlled. Late one night, as Richard stared at the messages on his phone, He felt a familiar rush of exhilaration. Madison had just texted him about a play she wanted to try at their next game. He knew she expected him to respond right away. She craved his approval. But at the same time, Laura was messaging him about her upcoming history test, asking for advice. He juggled both conversations effortlessly, each message carefully crafted to keep both girls hooked. This is perfect, he thought, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Tension began to build as Laura and Madison's lives subtly intersected. Laura started staying late after practice for one-on-one sessions with Mr. Caldwell, while Madison's private meetings with him became more frequent. Neither girl suspected the other, at least not yet, but Madison was starting to notice changes in Laura. "She's been acting weird lately," Madison remarked to one of her teammates after practice. "Like suddenly she thinks she's important or something." The teammate shrugged. "Maybe she's just trying harder. You know how Caldwell is. He's always pushing her." Something about the way Laura had been behaving lately didn't sit right with her. She decided to keep a closer eye on her. What Madison didn't know was that her suspicions would soon be confirmed in the most devastating way. Madison Collins's heart pounded in her chest as she walked down the dimly lit hallway toward the gym. It was late on a Friday evening, and she'd told her parents she was staying late to work on a group project. In truth, she was following a hunch that had been gnawing at her for weeks. Something was off. Over the past months, Laura Bennett had been acting smug, as if she knew something no one else did. Madison's conversations with Mr. Caldwell had grown shorter, less personal. The flirty banter she'd enjoyed so much was now riddled with awkward pauses, as if his mind were elsewhere. Madison had tried to ignore it, but she couldn't. Now, as she approached the gym doors, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She peeked inside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Richard Caldwell stood close to Laura, his hands gently resting on her shoulder. Laura was laughing, her cheeks flushed, her eyes locked on his with a mix of admiration and something deeper. It was the way they were standing, their proximity, their body language, that told Madison everything she needed to know. They weren't just talking. Madison clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as a wave of fury surged through her. She wanted to burst through the doors, scream at both of them, but she forced herself to retreat into the shadows. Her breathing was ragged, her mind racing. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself. That night, Madison lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Every image of Laura and Richard together replayed in her mind over and over again, each repetition stoking her anger. She felt humiliated, betrayed, and furious, not just at Laura but at Richard. He had promised her she was special, that what they had was real. By Monday, Madison had made a decision. She was going to confront them. The locker room smelled of sweat and damp towels. The eyes softened as Madison leaned against one of the lockers, her arms crossed as she waited for Richard and Laura to finish practice. Her heart was racing, but she masked it with a calm, almost cold exterior. "What's going on?" Laura asked, her voice timid. Madison stepped forward, her gaze locked on Richard. "Oh, don't play dumb. You think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting lately? The late texts? The secret meetings? You've been lying to me." "Madison, calm down," Richard said, his tone measured but firm. "You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Madison's voice cracked as her anger spilled over. "You're screwing her, aren't you?" She pointed at Laura, whose eyes widened in shock. "That's not true," Laura protested, her cheeks flushing. "Don't lie to me," Madison shouted, stepping closer. "I saw you two. I know what's going on." "Enough," Richard's voice boomed, silencing both girls. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "We need to talk about this calmly, like adults." But Madison wasn't having it. Her emotions boiled over, and before she could stop herself, she lunged at Laura. The next few moments were a blur. Madison's hands wrapped around Laura's throat as she screamed incoherent accusations, her nails digging into Laura's skin. Laura clawed at Madison's arms, gasping for air, but Madison's grip was unrelenting. "Stop it!" Richard shouted, trying to pull Madison off, but the force of her rage was too strong. Laura's struggles grew weaker, her eyes rolling back as her body went limp. When Madison finally let go, Laura collapsed to the cold tile floor, motionless. "Oh my God," Madison whispered, staring at her hands in disbelief. Richard knelt beside Laura, shaking her shoulder. "Laura? Laura, wake up!" His voice was panicked, his usual composure shattered. "She's not breathing," Madison said, her voice wild. "We need to fix this. Now." In the dead of night, Richard and Madison drove out to a secluded area on the outskirts of the city. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds their labored breaths and the crunch of leaves underfoot. They dug the grave in silence, neither daring to speak. Madison's hands were raw, her mind racing with a mix of guilt, fear, and numbness. When the grave was ready, they lowered Laura's body into the shallow hole. Madison stared at her lifeless face, her skin pale in the moonlight. Tears streamed down her cheeks as Richard began covering the body with dirt. "We can't tell anyone about this," Richard said, his voice cold and steady. "Do you understand me? No one." Madison nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. As they drove back to the city, the enormity of what they'd done began to sink in. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no going back. The days following Laura's disappearance felt surreal. Madison went through the motions at school, barely acknowledging her friends or teammates. She avoided eye contact with anyone, especially Richard. The weight of what they had done pressed on her chest like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. Oakwood Academy buzzed with rumors about Laura's sudden absence. Most of the students assumed she'd run away. "She was always so quiet," one of them whispered in the hall. "Maybe she just couldn't handle it here." Madison clung to these whispers, praying that everyone would believe Laura had left of her own accord. But deep down, she knew the truth would catch up to her eventually. Richard, on the other hand, managed to maintain his outward composure. He continued teaching and coaching, his demeanor as charming and confident as ever. But inside he was unraveling. Every knock on his classroom door, every glance from a student felt like a threat. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the moment when someone would expose him. At night his dreams were haunted by Laura. In them she stood at the edge of his bed, her lifeless eyes staring into his. Sometimes she spoke, her voice hollow and accusatory. "You did this to me." He began drinking heavily, hoping to drown the nightmares, but they only grew worse. Madison's guilt began manifesting in other ways. She could barely sleep, and when she did, her dreams were filled with dirt-covered hands clawing at her. Laura's pale face gasping for air. She found herself crying uncontrollably, at odd moments, during class, in the locker room, even in the middle of dinner with her family. Her grades started to slip, and her once perfect exterior began to crack. People noticed, but no one knew the real reason. Her friends thought she was stressed about college applications, or upset about Laura's disappearance. One evening, as Madison sat alone in her room, her phone buzzed. She grabbed it instinctively, expecting a message from her mom or a teammate. But when she saw the sender, her blood ran cold. Laura Bennett. The message was simple. "I know what you did." Madison dropped the phone as though it had burned her. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in short gasps. She picked it up again, her hands shaking as she reread the message. It wasn't possible. Laura was dead. She'd seen the life leave her eyes. She'd helped bury her. Her hands trembled as she typed back, "Who was this?" The response came immediately. "Meet me where you buried me. Tonight, 11 p.m. Across town, Richard was sitting in his dimly lit apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey, when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, assuming it was a late-night notification from one of the apps he never bothered to delete. But when it buzzed again, and again, he finally looked. The sender's name made his heart stop. "Laura Bennett, I know what you did," the message read. Richard's hands shook as he read it. He felt the room spinning, the walls closing in. It wasn't possible. He'd buried her himself. He'd made sure she wouldn't be found. He quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply was instant. Meet me where you buried me. Tonight. 11 p.m. The woods were darker than Madison remembered. The towering trees cast eerie shadows under the moonlight, and every rustling leaf sounded like a threat. She clutched her phone tightly in her hand, the message from Laura still open on the screen. She had tried to convince herself not to come. It was probably just a cruel joke, she thought. But a part of her needed to know. Richard arrived shortly after, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. You got the Texas too? Madison said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded, his jaw clenched. It has to be. Madison wasn't so sure. The two of them walked deeper into the woods, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Do you hear that? Madison whispered. Richard stopped, his ears straining. At first he heard nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Who's there? Richard called out, his voice shaking. There was no response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Madison's heart raced as she grabbed Richard's arm, and then they saw her. A figure emerged from the shadows, her face obscured by darkness. She wore a long, flowing dress, and her hair cascaded down her back in tangled waves. As she stepped into the moonlight, Madison's knees buckled. It was Laura. But it couldn't be. Laura was dead. The figure stopped a few feet away from them, her pale feet illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. Her lips curled into a chilling smile. Justice, she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. The figure stood before them in the darkness, a ghostly presence that seemed to pierce the very air with its chilling aura. Madison's heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the face before her. It was Laura, but something was off. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too vacant. Laura? Madison's voice was a mere whisper, barely audible as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile illusion before her. Laura didn't answer. She just smiled, her expression vacant and haunting. Her lips parted, but instead of speaking, she stepped back into the shadows, her figure dissolving into the darkness as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole. Madison stumbled backward, her legs weak with terror. What is this? What's happening? She spun toward Richard, her face twisted in confusion and dread. Richard's expression was no less terrified. He stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with disbelief. This doesn't make sense. We buried her. We saw her die. But before they could say more, a voice from the shadows interrupted them. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? The voice was unmistakable. It was Emma Green, a junior at Oakwood, someone who had always been friendly with Laura. Emma's voice dripped behind a tree, her steps purposeful as she emerged from behind a tree. Emma Green. Madison's stomach churned. Emma? But why was she here? What did she know? You think you can bury your secrets and move on with your lives, Emma continued, her eyes narrow with fury. You thought Laura's death would be the end of it, didn't you? But it's not over. Not by a long shot. Richard took a step forward, his voice firm but shaky. What do you want, Emma? Emma's cold smile remained fixed on her face. I know everything. Laura told me everything. Madison's blood ran cold. She couldn't breathe. She had no idea what Emma was talking about. Emma continued, her words laced with bitterness. The night before she disappeared, Laura came to me. She was scared. Scared of you, Richard. Scared of you, Madison. She knew what you were doing to her. She told me everything. Richard's face turned ashen. She? She came to you? Emma nodded, her expression unwavering. She was terrified, but you two didn't care. She begged me for help, but I was too late. By the time I found out, she was already gone. And then I saw it. The blood on your hands. Literally. Madison's world began to spin. She had no idea that Laura had gone to Emma for help. She thought she had been alone in her confusion, but now she realized that Laura had been reaching out, trying to save herself from a nightmare she couldn't escape. "What are you doing this?" Madison managed to ask, her voice trembling. "Why come here now?" "Because you need to pay for what you did." Emma's voice was cold, steely. "All of you." Suddenly, Emma's hand shot out from behind her back, producing a gleaming knife. The steel blade shimmered in the pale moonlight as she pointed it at them. Madison gasped, taking a step back. "Emma, stop, please, you don't have to do this." But Emma's gaze was unwavering, filled with a righteous fury that Madison could feel deep in her bones. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not when you've destroyed everything Laura had. Not when you've buried her like she was nothing." Without warning, Emma lunged at Richard, her knife slashing through the air with terrifying speed. Richard barely had time to react, but his instincts kicked in. He stepped back, but Emma was faster. Emma was stronger than she looked, her determination to make them pay driving her every move. Madison could feel her grip weakening, but just as Emma raised the knife again, Richard, bleeding heavily, barely able to stand, grabbed Emma's wrist, yanking her off balance. The knife clattered to the ground. For a brief moment, all was still. The only sound was their ragged breathing, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Madison and Emma stared at each other, both covered in blood, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, Richard made his decision. Without a word, he grabbed the knife from the ground. In one swift motion, he plunged the blade deep into Emma's chest. Emma's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening in a silent scream. She staggered back, blood spurting from the wound, her legs giving out beneath her as she collapsed to the ground. Madison watched in horror, unable to move, her body frozen by the scene unfolding before her. Emma's body twitched once, twice, before falling completely still. The forest around them seemed to close in as the sound of her last breath filled the air. The stillness in the woods after Emma's death was suffocating. The only sound was the distant rustling of trees, the faint breeze carrying with it the smell of earth and blood. Richard stood over Emma's body, his chest heaving with exertion. His hands trembled, slick with her blood, as he stared at the lifeless girl lying in the dirt. Madison felt numb, like she was watching from outside her own body. Everything around her seemed unreal, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her arm burned where the knife had grazed it, but the pain felt distant, unimportant, compared to the horror unfolding before her. Richard dropped to his knees, his gaze flickering between Madison and Emma's body. "We're done, Madison," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We can't keep running from this." Madison shook her head, unable to speak. There were no words for this, no way to make sense of what they had just done. They had killed Laura, and now Emma. There was no escaping it, no way to wash their hands clean. Richard's voice broke the silence. "We have to cover this up. The police, they'll come for us. We need to make sure no one ever finds her." Madison nodded numbly. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. She was beyond the point of caring about consequences. She had already crossed so many lines, there was nothing left to protect. Together, they dragged Emma's body into the woods. Just as they had done with Laura, it was almost a mechanical process. No words, no emotion, just a desperate need to hide the truth. Once Emma was buried, Richard and Madison stood in the clearing, looking at the freshly dug grave. The night air hung heavy around them, as though the earth itself was suffocating under the weight of their guilt. "What now?" Madison asked, her voice barely audible. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the stars, his eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. "Now, we go back to our lives. We pretend like nothing happened." But Madison knew better. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The truth would come out. It always did. The following morning, the city of Seattle was rocked by the shocking discovery of 2 bodies in the woods, just outside the city limits. The authorities had stumbled upon the shallow graves of both Laura Bennett and Emma Green, buried under hastily piled dirt. It didn't take long for the police to piece together the details. Both girls had been missing for weeks, their sudden disappearances now linked by their untimely deaths. Madison had never felt so cold. She woke that morning, the weight of the night's events still pressing down on her like a stone in her chest. The gym, the confrontation with Emma, had only been the beginning of the fallout. What followed was a descent into a nightmare she couldn't escape. By noon, the police were knocking on her door. Madison's parents were in disbelief, refusing to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Their daughter, once known as the perfect student, the picture of success, was now at the center of an unspeakable crime. "Madison Collins, you are under arrest for the murder of Laura Bennett and Emma Green," the officer said, his voice steady but cold. The evidence was overwhelming. There were messages from Laura's phone, messages that had come from Madison's own device as well, revealing the tangled web of lies they had built. Surveillance footage from the gym and surrounding areas showed her and Richard arriving at the scene, and there were witnesses, people who had seen Madison and Emma together in the days leading up to her death. But the most damning evidence of all was the state of the bodies. Both Laura and Emma had been violently murdered, their wounds consistent with the knife that had been used in the final confrontation in the gym. It was a brutal, undeniable truth, and there was no escaping it. As she sat in the interrogation room, her mind was a haze. She couldn't understand why she had allowed things to spiral so far, why she had participated in these unspeakable acts. Her once perfect life, her future, had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. The trial that followed was swift. Madison's defense attorney argued that she had been manipulated by Richard, that she was simply a pawn in his sick game. But the jury wasn't swayed. They could not ignore the fact that Madison had participated willingly in the cover-up, that she had helped bury Laura, and later, Emma. The texts, the surveillance footage, and the damning evidence painted a picture of a girl who had lost her way, consumed by the lies she had told herself. Madison's parents attended the trial in silence, their faces unreadable, their sorrow profound. They had raised a daughter who had seemingly had everything going for her, and now they were left to grapple with the fact that their child was responsible for two young girls' deaths. Then the verdict came. It was inevitable. Madison was found guilty of second-degree murder for the deaths of Laura Bennett and Emma Green, and guilty of accessory to murder for her role in Richard Caldwell's death. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. In the years that followed, Madison was left alone with her thoughts, locked away in a small prison cell. She had nothing but time. Time to think about her actions. Time to reflect on how things had gone so horribly wrong. It was in this isolation that Madison began to truly confront the horrors of what she had done. She had killed two girls. She had allowed Richard Caldwell, a man she had trusted, to manipulate her into believing that their relationship was something special. In the end, she had destroyed everything that had been good in her life. Every night, she relived the events that had led to Laura's death, the fight in the locker room, the way she had choked the life from her, the blood that had spilled in the woods, and Emma, her betrayal of Emma, who had trusted her to protect her friend. Emma's final words still echoed in Madison's mind. "You're monsters. Both of you." And they were. Madison knew now, as she sat in her cell, that the guilt would never leave her. It gnawed at her, a constant presence in her thoughts. There would be no peace for her, no forgiveness. The outside world had moved on. People had forgotten about her, about the tragedy at Oakwood Academy. But for Madison, the memory of what she had done remained vivid, a weight that she carried with her every day. She could never escape it. But maybe, in some strange way, she didn't want to. The guilt, the pain, it was hers to bear. And it would be a reminder of the lives she had destroyed, the choices she had made, and the monsters she had become. If you enjoyed this dive into the mystery, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime OCS for more chilling stories from history's darkest corners. Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Let's untangle the truth together. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.